Welcome to Movement 1, where we will look into the issue of identity and the past. Specifically in this session, we will be looking at how different types of infrastructures encode and perpetuate inequalities. Before I provide maybe some insight as to the importance of this topic, let me introduce our four panelists, and we're very happy to have them with us today. First, Araceli Camargo, who is the founder of the Eurocentric Lab. Her work has specifically explored the implication of urban design and physical infrastructure on risks to health and well-being. We will also be joined today by Naushin Anwar, who is the director of the Karachi Urban Lab. Her work focuses on the relationship between refugee, migrants, and urban infrastructures and services. We're also very happy to have today Mona Fawaz, who's the co-director of the Beirut Urban Lab. And like the previous panelist, Mona's work explores the intersections between urban infrastructure and marginalized communities, especially on the edge of society. Finally, we're very happy to have Ashta Kampur with us, who is the founder of the APTI Institute, who specifically focuses on new model of data ownership, specifically looking at the individual perspectives. So thank you again, panelists, for joining us. Let me highlight maybe some of the reasons why this particular issue was highlighted for today's sessions. As some of you may know, I work in Lebanon, and I think we particularly think that this topic is important. As you may know, the impact of successive crises over the last 18 months, included the COVID crisis, the Beirut port explosion, the economic and fiscal crisis that the country has experienced, are exacerbating inequalities, while obviously increasing human vulnerability. For us, as we look at the issue of the recovery of Beirut, the questions of urban planning will be central to this agenda. And we're actually very happy to be partnering with Mona Fawaz, actually, in trying to see how we apply an urban approach to recovery in one of the neighborhood, the Karantina neighborhood in Beirut, that has been the most affected by the blast. So we very much look forward not only to these discussions, but also to the useful insight that this collaboration will bring forward. We will now start our panel discussions with our esteemed speakers. I will first start with Araceli and ask a few questions to reflect on her experience. So Araceli, how do you come to focus on this all road lead to health approach? How current urban planning is exacerbating biological inequalities among people living in the same city? Can you share some examples for us of how urban planning is mitigating and reducing biological inequalities?
Okay, so there's a lot, I think, of new words that have been mentioned. So I'm going to start with definitions before I answer the question. So for the listeners, please don't lose the will to live as I go through the definitions. So the first thing to understand is the context of neuroscience. So neuroscience usually gets misdefined or misunderstood as only the study of the brain, but it's actually the study of the brain and the nervous system. And we are specifically looking at the HPA axis. That's its short term, but it's the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which goes from the brain down to the adrenal glands, which sit on top of your kidneys. Hormones get released, they feed back to the brain. And so it's this constant feedback loop. And what this response does is that it mitigates the stress response. Sorry, the system mitigates the stress response. And the stress response is one of our adaptive systems. And so there's another word to define. So by adaptation, it means that your body will respond to an external or internal change in order to come back to homeostasis. So for example, if you feel hot, our bodies will begin to, obviously, they'll get the sensorial information from our skin, but then also the HPA axis will engage, and that will begin to engage your sweat glands. So you begin to sweat, to begin to cool down, your heart rate's going to change, your even the way that you're breathing, so your lungs, the way they're expanding and contracting, all of it is going to change to help you, again, adapt to this new change to the heat. What we do then is that we use that system to understand how areas that we live in either support us and allow us to come back to homeostasis. For example, if you are encountering heat, do you have things within your environment? So if we were in the natural habitat, we would have heat, but we would also have shade. We would have a way to also use the environment to come back to homeostasis. But in these urban environments that have been made by us, we have depleted almost every single thing that we can naturally to be able to come back to homeostasis. So that's where the next definition comes in, of biological inequality. So we started off as calling it biological inequality, and then we migrated over to biological inequity, because inequality means that there is a unequal distribution of something, but inequity actually means that there are other factors that contribute to the distribution. And of course, unfortunately, we live in a still very much a colonized, imperialist, racist, and transphobic and homophobic and ableist societies that impose these systems and how we actually build cities. And we all feel it, right? As in, anybody that belongs to a marginalized community feels these systems. And unfortunately, you are forced to live in environments that we call, or we have identified as, biologically unequal, or you are yourself experiencing biological inequity. So what does that actually mean? So for example, if you are a Black trans woman, you are more than likely to be discriminated against in terms of jobs, in terms of housing and shelter. And that means you are unable to find adequate homes. And by adequate homes, I mean simple things like running water, or shelter that actually shelters you, right? So from the heat or from the cold. And so you're dealing with the environmental stressors, but you're also dealing with psychosocial stressors, which we also look at. So we are looking at the environmental stressors that Black, Indigenous, people of color, and marginalized communities are experiencing in disproportion. So that's air, noise, light, and urban heat island effect. But on top of that, living in those environments, there's a deprivation, and there's also an awareness of living in those environments. So you have all these pathways of stress, and in some cases, trauma, that are constantly asking the body to adapt. Eventually, that has a breaking point, or what we call wear and tear, and that's what we call allostatic overload. So, and that in itself, that is what biological inequity is, and that we are identifying both the areas where there's biological inequity, but then the communities and the people that are experiencing it. So yeah, we have to look at the built environment in a new framing, and perhaps even in a new language, that the built environment is healthcare, right? So we're going beyond healthcare of when we go to the doctor. That should really almost be like, that's like the final end of the supply chain. But we have to think about how in someone's home, you know, are they breathing in mold? Do they have the infrastructure to cook nourishing food? Are they living in a home that internally is noisy and overcrowded, but also perhaps internally also noisy and overcrowded? They may not have housing at all, which is, again, even a more acute stress. And we also have to look at where these homes are located. Are they next to an industrial plant that forces them to constantly breathe in very noxious air? Or are they next to toxic soil? Are they next to a very busy road where there is no respite from light, noise, and air pollution? And then we have to think about, if we're looking specifically at Indigenous people, we have to think about land rights, that when people are displaced, there's family separation, there is the separation of what you know as nourishment and what you know as medicine. And that again is another set of stressors. Then you can look at something like transport. Transport, people often think, you know, it is you move from point A to point B, but how are you moving from point A to point B? So if you are a person that has a disability and you are not able to get on a bus or on a train because it might be too far from your home, or you just don't feel safe because it doesn't have the infrastructure, that isolates you socially, adding and exasperating to symptoms of social isolation, but also loneliness and anxiety. And the same thing, you can take it to the other extreme of, sorry, not another extreme, but of another instance in terms of safety. Psychological safety is also very important. So we've spoken to women, as in women with an X, of the transportation tax that they have to have, because it's a constant negotiation of feeling safe. And again, if you are not participating in a city and you can't, or you feel like you can't participate in the city because you don't feel safe in engaging with it, again, that's another stressor. And then finally, where these transportation hubs are usually found, whether it's the depots or the train stations, but are highly, highly polluted places. And then your journey is also highly polluted. So if you are poor, and unfortunately, then on top of that, I don't say unfortunately you're a woman, but on top of that, you have the stressor of the marginalization of being a woman. And you are doing so many more commutes that are longer. And that is putting you into sedentary behavior, exposing you to more levels of air pollution. That's going to have a massive difference in the person that might be living in the same city with the same, let's say, overarching levels of air, noise, and light pollution, et cetera. But their exposure is a lot different, and their experience and their psychological stressors are a lot different. And so that wear and tear on the bodies are very, very different. And that's what we're looking to acknowledge, is what are those lived experience and habitat? How are they contributing to the exposure of stressors, but also what does a person have to mitigate the stressors?
Thank you very much for your insight. Let me ask you another question. The Centric Lab that you are leading has produced the COVID-19 and biological inequality report. In your view, how has COVID revealed biological inequalities among marginalized communities? And what are some of the guiding principles that could help us reimagine infrastructure in cities post-pandemic?
Okay, so this is another deep breath, because the answer is long. So we did, the study that we did, we looked at it from a literature review, which means that we looked at really going into this depth of what causes biological inequity and what are the different pathways. And then we looked at a London data study. So we're like, so we're giving you the theory, but now we're going to give you the practice. And we chose London mainly because London has such great access to open data. And I think that's a very important part to the latter part of the question. And so in 2019, we had mapped out areas of biological inequity. We call them areas of health emergency. And we put our little map up. No one listened. And so in 2020, when we had the pandemic, we thought, okay, this is a very unfortunate way to check our work, but let's check our work through this. Are the areas that we identified as areas of health emergency or biological inequity, are those the areas that are also already presenting themselves as high COVID rates? So we did the study actually in May, and then we did it again towards the end of last year. So we looked at the evolution of COVID. Both times, the areas of biological inequity matched up to the areas of high COVID. And so in the study, we show a map of where Black and Asian communities live and where there's biological inequity. So of course, there is a huge contrast between the two. And then when you put on top of that the COVID areas, there's almost a 1-for-1 match. So it's high, the relationship. And so What we wanted to extract from that are two things. It's that it's racism, not race. There's even a recent Guardian article that said that ethnicity is a risk factor. Language is so important. Ethnicity is not a risk factor. What is the discriminatory policies, the discriminatory day-to-day decisions made by people that affect the way people live, the way that people, the work that they do. So yes, there are what I would call direct mechanisms in terms of the BAME communities, which are, they disproportionately uphold the essential work, which exposed them to the virus disproportionately. From there, they went to homes that were overcrowded and perhaps not able to get the acquired sleep. Not be able to get the acquired space from the overcrowding. But then we have to look at the secondary and systemic pathways, which are exactly as I just said, sleep. So shift workers have historically been known to have higher rates of respiratory problems through the deregulation of the immune system, but also of our circadian system, because unfortunately, the more you sleep out of our natural sleep-wake cycles, the higher risk you are for insomnia. And with insomnia comes a tirade of chronic disorders. So you were already dealing with a community of people that had starter deregulations to no fault of their own, right? This is nothing to do with them as an ethnicity, as a race, or even genetically as it's been spoken to. Genetically, perhaps in the most essential part of the definition, if you think of genes as a little container of information that passes on information to how to adapt, yes, but you still have to take into account that those adaptations and those changes in those adaptations are still back to do with the environment. And so again, this ecological lens allows us to be anti-racist, because we understand that it's things like racism and classism and all those awful discriminatory isms that are having this contribution rather than the person itself.
Thank you very much. Now I will ask you the last question for the purpose of this panel discussions. How does health justice relate to environment or climate justice in your view? Specifically, maybe looking at issues of indigenous health or land governance.
So again, it's important to always start with definitions. Indigeneity, there are indigenous communities all over the world, Americas, Arctic Circle, Asia, etc., Africa, that are, whilst the day-to-day experiences, of course, are unique, there are some overarching pathways in terms of land rights and land governance. So we all know the stats that right now, where there is the highest level of biodiversity left are the places that are guarded by or protected by indigenous communities. But going more into that stat, that also means, yes, why does the biodiversity exist? The biodiversity also means that there's cleaner water, that the soil is more fertile, that the air is cleaner. It also means that those areas actually have an immunity, let's say, to climate change. And they also have access to medicine. A lot of our medicine, even the pharmaceutical medicine, has roots within the natural world. And there's also community cohesion in these also highly biodiversity. So it's not just to say biodiversity, it's like what's causing that biodiversity. So when an indigenous community is taken off their land, and it's happening all the time, every day, in a very similar way as colonialism has always existed, they are, yes, they are taken off their land, but that land is no longer governed by scientists, scholars, ecologists that understand for millennia what that land is supposed to do. So we, as a macro human society, and I would even say as a macro being society, we lose that knowledge and we get deeper into the problem that we're supposedly trying to solve. So when all of that is ticking, when you have the identification of high biodiversity and you have that full functioning of ecology, you do see good health outcomes. I'm not saying that health is perfect, because there are multi-factors again to health, and there are different things that different communities also face that could be affecting their health, of course. But you have a level of resilience within the environment that we're losing. Now, conversely, when those land rights are not protected and the land governance goes away, for the indigenous people, they face displacement and forced migration, as we're seeing in the border coming from South America up to North America. And that is trauma, right? The trauma of losing loved ones, the trauma of moving away from your land that has been with you for generations. You mourn the land itself, your relationship with that land. For anybody that has a deep relationship with nature and land, it is a form of that you're losing a relative. You're not just losing in the abstract, you're losing a relative. And so with that carries PTSD. PTSD is, again, another very complex full system deregulation that opens up to diabetes and anxiety and obesity. And there are many studies that are going into how quickly the body changes for people that are indigenous backgrounds and going into cities, that they are displaying things like depression and anxiety. They develop it at almost a faster rate than those of us who have been living in cities for a very long time. And that is worth studying, because that might be related to the trauma that they experience, that deregulation of the acute trauma puts them on that path a lot faster. There are other factors, such as their bodies just are not accustomed to air pollution and to all the other toxins. They haven't had that, like almost like we're like little frogs that slowly are boiling. And our bodies are trying to adapt. And then, of course, there's the family separation. There's the contamination of the lands. I mean, again, the stories are unfortunately abundant of water being polluted, which we know can go from skin rashes to respiratory disorders to cardiovascular. But also cardiovascular disorders are highly linked to depression. So when we get a cardiovascular disorder or any other disorder that affects our breathing or affects the actual heart rate, and that's something I think really poetic to look at, that we disturb a community's breathing when we take away land and contaminate land, the very essential mechanism that we need for life. And so with that, again, comes a lot of physiological trauma. Cardiovascular diseases are highly, highly linked to depression and anxiety. And you can see why, because the body is actually not being able to breathe properly. There's, of course, the loss of nourishment, and of course, acute poverty and homelessness, which again, we come back to the trauma pathway. So this is we're reaching a boiling point in Indigenous people, which I am part of, that are experiencing acute disorders whilst living in impoverished city environments or impoverished environments.
So thank you very much for those useful insights. And then I will now move to Naoshin to speak to the specific experience from the Karachi Urban Lab. My first question to you, the Karachi Urban Lab focuses a lot of its work on the politics of infrastructure development. What does the practice of your lab look like? What type of projects are you engaged in?
So at the KUL, we're sort of quite open-ended and experimental in the way that we take on projects and the manner in which we include our colleagues and collaborate on different kinds of projects. And so currently we're involved in 4 different projects, one of which has been a 2.5-year project looking at the dynamics of land displacement in Karachi, which is Pakistan's largest metropolis center. And the two more projects which are engaged in climate change related issues, one of which I'm going to focus on today. We're going to talk about it a little bit more. And a 4th one, which is actually trying to push the boundaries of our research by going beyond the metropolis and taking a more experimental view on sort of observing and taking a longitudinal view, thinking about how new infrastructural developments and new sort of flows of capital beyond the metropolis and in what are typically called small and intermediate towns or smaller urban centers, what is the impact of these new dynamics on other parts of Pakistan cities, but really going beyond the metropolis to look at those kinds of issues. And our teams are generally always multidisciplinary. So I have colleagues that I work with who are often social psychologists, urban planners like me, also geographers, people with a background in anthropology, science and technology experts. And one of the things that we are very, very keenly committed to at the KUL is to mentor undergraduate and graduate students through our projects and our research engagements, and hoping to also connect in ways to figure out new pedagogies of learning and teaching. And so that it also enables a younger generation of urbanists, if I might call them, to leverage new ways of learning and understandings. So mentorship is also a very important part of what we do here at KUL.
Thank you very much. Let me ask you as a follow-up another question that also deals to the issue of politics and infrastructure. How does one understand the power and political implication of infrastructure? For example, you are currently investigating the inequalities associated with cooling infrastructure in developing countries. What can we learn from this type of work? What is it that planners and development organizations don't see?
We're currently involved in an extensive 3-year project called Cool Infrastructures, Life with Heat in the Off-Grid City. And this is in collaboration with colleagues located in Jakarta, Indonesia, Yaoundé, Cameroon, Hyderabad, India, as well as in Germany and the University of Edinburgh in England. And this particular project looks at vulnerability through the lens of heat. And the project is essentially premised on that one grand question, which is, how do we meet the global challenge of rising temperatures? So the United Nations currently estimates that there are something like 1.1 billion people across the world who have little or no access to cooling to protect them from extreme heat. And the populations that are most at risk are something like 630 million people living across South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa. And typically, these are people who live in poor quality housing, on low incomes with limited or intermittent or insecure access to electricity, water, and transportation infrastructures, and few, if any, electrical cooling appliances. And the associated risks of heat-related illnesses are typically heat strokes, dehydration, infectious diseases, and even economic stagnation. So we might observe decline in employment, in worker productivity, and output. So cooling, as we argue in our project, is a very essential dynamic in meeting virtually all of the sustainable development goals. So if we think, for instance, about SDG2 on hunger, SDG 3 on health, SDG 7 on sustainable energy, SDG 9 on infrastructure, and SDG 11 on cities, cooling is a very, very essential dynamic to meeting all of these SDGs. So if we take, for instance, the 4 cities that we're currently focusing on in our project, and these are cities that are situated across Sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. So we look at Karachi, Jakarta, Hyderabad, and Yaoundé in the Cameroon, which have extensive populations. And these are cities that experience typically many, many days where the temperature rises above 30 degrees Celsius. And these are also cities that have experienced the heat island effects, where we are seeing, in terms of its planning and its built environment, extensive use of asphalt and concrete in construction, and also diminishing green spaces, all of which combined adds as much as 12 Celsius to average recorded temperatures. Now, if we cast an eye on global efforts to deal with extreme heat, what are we looking at, right? So we're looking at global efforts in which there has been a considerable impetus put on speeding up the development of urban heat action plans, on catalyzing urban markets for affordable and efficient electrical cooling technologies, and even supporting green designs for housing and public spaces. But there is also a conundrum in these kinds of global efforts. And the big conundrum is that electrically powered solutions also create new stresses on already precarious energy grids. And the other problem is that when we look at cities like Karachi, typically, for instance, we find that the governance or the planning of these kinds of global efforts to manage extreme heat are also often very top-down and technology-driven. So what we are observing are significant gaps in evidence and data concerning the impact of heat and the nature of cooling technologies that we might need to, to deal with or to innovate about in the coming future, I would say even right now. So what are some of these significant gaps? For instance, lack of qualitative data on urban energy cultures, practices, and behaviors. Lack of context-specific local knowledge on local innovation and adaptation of marginalized urban residents to heat. Very limited understanding of social and material politics of cooling in urban spaces. And in addition to all of this, limited understanding of the market dynamics that are shaping clean, cool technology pathways. And by market dynamics, I don't just mean global market dynamics or national level market dynamics. I mean really localized urban contexts in which there might be specific kind of market dynamics that are shaping people's access to cool technology pathways. So if we keep these significant gaps in terms of evidence and data, what we are seeing is that the current indications suggest that without new knowledge and expertise on cooling, the SDGs that I talked about are highly unlikely to be met. And specifically, the data on vulnerability of groups of men and women living in subtropical and tropical cities and their experiences to heat continues to be hampered by a lack of attention to social and ecological contexts. So risk assessments and vulnerability indices frequently fail to consider the ways gender, identity, and socioeconomic inequalities intersect to create specific risks for groups of men and women working at home or in the informal economy. So the challenge then is that how do we address this knowledge gap, right? And one of the things that we are doing in our project, in this collaborative project, is to reframe heat as a bodily experience of space and place, rather than to think about heat as something that is a one-time event like a heat wave, or something that is about ambient temperatures, or something that is fixed in terms of space, right? So we're trying to reframe heat as the bodily experience of space and place. And I will very briefly mention one particular aspect of this project that I find particularly important. How does heat help us to understand and analyze social, economic, and gender inequalities in the off-grid city, right? And what do we mean by the off-grid city? Typically, where a vast majority of urban populations don't have access to 24 hours of electricity, don't have access to continuous flows of water, etc. And the energy water component is interrelated when we think about cooling infrastructures and managing heat. So we know that extreme heat disproportionately affects the poorest and most marginalized urban residents living in densely populated low-income settlements because they have the least ability to modulate thermal flows and their exposure to them. And these heat effects are also localized and they're deeply gendered. So we examine in our project the capacity of women and men to regulate heat by managing their physical movements, by consuming food and water, or through relationships to others. So a sub-question of that major question that we pose on the interlinkages between heat, gender, and equality is, how do women and men experience what we call thermal mobility, right? And what do we mean by thermal mobility? The movement up or down categories of access to cooling, essentially, right? And one of the things that we are looking at over here at Karachi Urban Lab when we think about thermal mobility is, how do ordinary citizens negotiate shade, right? And when we're talking about these ordinary citizens, we're talking about not only informal, but also formal workers who spend a considerable amount of time working outside or throughout the day. Is shade an inalienable right? I mean, how do we think about shade in the context of rising global temperatures? Why is it important to think about shade? as we are getting deeper and deeper into this shade project, we're putting together some visual images of street workers, street vendors, street hawkers, policemen, rickshaw drivers, construction workers who spend a considerable amount of time out there in open space and are continuously exposed to the sun's radiation. So this is the issue, right? So this is not just about heat waves. This is about solar emissions and the constant exposure to heat. And one of the things that we are trying to investigate are what are the vernacular practices of shade, right? So when we think about energy cultures and sort of the everyday cultures of heating and cooling, one of the ways in which we try to insert ourselves in these investigations is by looking at the adaptive strategies of poor men and women who work outdoors throughout the day.
So thank you very much for your insight. Now I will pass over to Mona Fawaz, who's the co-director of the Beirut Urban Lab. Mona, it's very nice to see you. I will ask the first question. One of the reasons we were drawn to the Beirut Urban Lab is that it merges practice with theory. The Beirut Urban Lab and UNDP are actually working together around the people-centered recovery process for a neighborhood of Beirut called Karantina, which is the most affected neighborhood after the August blast. Can you give us an example as to what this will entail, as well as examples of other projects that you are undertaking in the current context of reconstruction after the blast?
Sure. So yeah, hi, and thank you for having me. So I guess one of the main reasons why people approach us when there are real life challenges is because we are scholars and researchers. And what we do for a living is try to frame questions appropriately, try to frame problems in a way that they can be understood properly, and hence address in a more integrated, comprehensive, inclusive way. And so the projects that I've been involved in over the last 2 decades in Beirut, whether it was the post-2006 war reconstruction or the refugee influx in Lebanon and how to think through a response, particularly in relation to shelter, and more recently, the Beirut port blast, have all been about trying to think through what question should we ask, and who should be on board when we ask this question, so we can ask the right question and we can answer with the right actors the right question, with proposals that we can try over time. For the post-disaster recovery, the big question is really that notion of recovery. What is it that we're trying to recover from after the Beirut port blast? And what became very clear to us in that case, and I think this is a very nice connection between practice and theory, is the fact that when you understand that most of the challenges that were pointed out in the post-disaster recovery, that people were leaving their homes, they were unable to come back, that the city's culture, identity, the shared spaces, and the heritage were being lost, are actually issues that were being lost already before the blast. So in some sense, what we said is the blast is an accelerator. It comes to accentuate vulnerability, inequality. It comes to push people further away from where they want to live. It comes to destroy heritage further and make it harder to rebuild it. And so what we wanted to do is to design the processes that can, on the long run, recover the city for its residents, and to think about ways in which we can create the proper synergies between actors who will be involved in this. Which public institutions do you need on the table? Which communities? And how do you reconcile the fact that people may not really always be in harmony, but that they need to be participating with the right questions in the right roles as well? And so to just give you a quick example, with our collaboration with UNDP in the neighborhood of Karantina, we have set up a partnership in which we work together with a vision of not intervening in one project, but putting in place a process of recovery, doing research, bringing on board communities, training residents so they become what we call citizen scientists, so that they produce with my colleague the kind of questions and knowledge and information that they think is valuable for them to be involved over the coming years in a project of recovery. And then UNDP comes to say, we will implement these projects, we will work with you as partners, and we will create that cycle so that recovery doesn't appear as if it's like one moment in which you just do one project, or you imagine it as simply rebuilding a volume, and it really becomes a way in which partnerships and institutions and know-how are set in place, and people are anchored in where they live, and they figure out ways in which they can become the custodians of their neighborhood and help have them grow and really prosper as spaces of livability in which they are also happy, because ultimately that's your role as someone intervening in a post-disaster recovery.
Thank you very much, Mona, for your analysis and your insights. Let me ask you my second question. I think it's sobering to hear how reconstruction efforts after crises like the Beirut blast tend to embed a range of societal biases that exist in our society, and how typical quantitative damage assessment performed by governments and development organizations sometimes can miss the point of a holistic reconstruction. In your view, and based on your experience, how do we fill that gap?
Yeah, that's a great question. I remember in 2006 that we were working with actors who were very keen on seeing the residents of the neighborhoods come back to where they should come, to where they were displaced. And at the same time, we were feeling very uneasy because the sense of that reconstruction was essentially about asking who owned what and how can we return this number of square meters for this person so that the same volume is rebuilt, as if reconstruction could possibly be simply an exercise in geometry and construction in which you say this family lost 500 square meters, or this other family lost 50 square meters, and we need to return to each that number of square meters. That kind of conception misses completely the point of what makes a city. A city is about relationships between people that tie them together, that help them be able to govern and prosper in the space in which they are. And for that, you have to understand what anchors residents in their place, so they don't just say, oh my God, this neighborhood is too devastated, or there are too many problems. Why would I return here? I'll just get my compensation and I leave. And particularly when you reduce the significance of commercial streets in which people have anchored memories and histories, public spaces where people recognize their own stories growing up, their relationships with their neighbors, a pet perhaps used to walk here, what made you a collective at the same time. If you don't recognize those and you limit the sense of reconstruction to a mere set of volumes, you leave very little of the attachment that makes a place. And it makes a normal calculation like this would mean that at least the residents who can afford to leave will simply get their compensation and leave, because what attached them to this neighborhood and that place is lost. And that produces a relationship with the city where one's place in the city becomes very much a transaction. You become a client who's looking for the most comfortable space. And what you lose is the fact that as a city dweller, you're an urban citizen and you have a critical role to play in the protection of your neighborhood, in its livelihood and its economy, that you're invested in buying from the local store under your store, that you're invested in caring about your elderly neighbor who needs something. And so really from that perspective, it seems to me that it's super important that we widen the notion of what is being recovered or what is being rebuilt, so that we are including people's livelihood in a much more integrated way.
Thank you, Mona, for your response. I will ask you now the last question on issues of finance. You've done research on how financial infrastructure preserves and exacerbates inequality pattern. In your view and experience, how do we design intervention that acknowledge the power exerted by finance? And how do we open up spaces that can reimagine alternative urban future that challenge all patterns of inequalities?
Yeah, that's really important. When you guys talk to me about infrastructure, my instinct was to navigate with Abdulmalik Simon and say the most important infrastructure of a city is its people. And he very nicely argued that what really constitutes the possibility of a city is people as its infrastructure, the services people do to each other, how they support each other. But then when I started thinking about Beirut, and I thought, okay, so we also have to recognize that there are certain networks, certain structures that are set in place to facilitate particular processes. And these structures, if we don't pay attention to them, they may take cities to places like what we saw in Beirut over the last 3 decades. And it's the first post-war reconstruction after 1990. And here the infrastructure of finance is critical, because what it has done is it has tried to set in place more and more facilities in which people who are looking for a place to park their money, to invest for assets, began to see Beirut as a place in which they could buy an apartment or they could buy a piece of land. And when piece by piece, the city becomes a place where places that are hijacked, almost like safety deposit boxes in the banks, as opposed to places in which people can work or live or play, then what you have is you have a destruction of that social value of the city. And instead, you get that infrastructure of finance expanding and making it easier and easier for investments to happen. And what we saw in the last 30 years in Lebanon is more and more facilities being put forward and incentives being put forward by the central bank and by public agencies, including planning agencies, in order to facilitate the investments that people can make to buy an apartment. And that devastated the city, because we ended up with vacancy rates for apartments, for example, that were in some neighborhoods as high as 50%. So 1 in 2 apartments was simply kept as an investment. And this really destroys the life of the street. It destroys the possibility of a local economy. It really changes the ways in which you can imagine the possibility of an inclusive economy. And so and for people who live in the city, then when you demand your right, you begin to demand your right to have access to that finance. And so you see that residents quickly were being pushed to take a loan from a bank, sometimes subsidized, in order to be able to own a home in 30 years. And so they lost their right to the city as urban dwellers who have the right to own a home or just live in the city. And instead, their clients desperately trying to return the loan and really being disciplined by that sequence in which you have to return the home, even if it means that you're going to work 2 jobs, if it means you're going to eat less, you're going to skimp on that medical treatment you need because you have to return the loan. So ultimately, we reached the collapse. We reached right before the explosion, the Beirut port blast, in which we had a major financial crisis in the city. And what we need to do today is to say that we need to recover the city from this infrastructure of finance, to recover places for livelihood. We need to deploy tools of planning like zones of special social interest or other methods in which neighborhoods are recovered as places of livelihood, that where finance cannot enter, that cannot be used as investments, that have to be used for their use value and protected as spaces of inhabitants. To me, this is the first step that has to happen in the post-blast areas, because the neighborhoods were suffering enormously from the financial investments. Most of these neighborhoods were neighborhoods that had been very heavily targeted by financial investments because they have an architectural value, because they have a historical value. So investors felt that they were desirable. And these places today need to be recovered. A different political imaginary need to be set in place that would allow us to really recover these neighborhoods as places in which they prioritize the people who live in them and not the investors who are going to place their money inside them.
Thank you very much, Mona, for your insight. Now I will turn to Ashtaq Kapoor from the Abdi Institute. Thank you very much for being with us today, and let me ask you first questions. In your experience, how do you see the development paradigm driven by influence from the global north affect our relationship with technology, and in particular the ownership and agency of one one's data? Specifically, if you can speak to us about the cost of this development paradigm seen from the perspective of marginalized groups that live in the Global South.
Yeah, thank you so much first for having me at the Istanbul Innovation Days. I'm delighted to be here. And thank you also for this question. I guess this is something that we've been talking about, and I think that there is a lot of muttering that's happening in other parts of the world as well, is that the sort of quote unquote Western way of thinking about technology and especially data, which is where my focus is atomized and individualized, which is that, you know, data belongs to individuals, and therefore the rights and protections when it comes to data are also individualized. Privacy is, and harms of privacy or impact individuals. But what I think, and this kind of view I think is peculiar, and we say Western, but I think that there are elements of it that need to be challenged. And I think that challenge is coming both from a reimagination of our relationship with data more broadly, but also from, and I don't like using this phrase, but the Global South, which is that we have a more sort of community idea of both data and our relationship with it. I think that similarly, I think that the fact that privacy is dynamic and it changes between groups, between individuals and their interaction with groups also needs to be taken into cognizance when thinking about our relationship with data and then its governance. So, you know, understanding that privacy is relational. So data about me is also impacting data about other women in South Asia, for instance. And also similarly, data about women in South Asia impacts me. So, you know, it's relational. Similarly, like harm also is derived from different ways. So, you know, data about minorities in certain parts of the world may harm individuals and vice versa. So I think that increasingly realizing the relational value of data, the fact that it is indeed a community resource or a community object is imperative. And then as we think about it, we move away from this sense of individual protection and individual rights, which are critical, and I'm not challenging that, but those are not the only rights that are relevant when it comes to data. I think we need to think more broadly about community rights to data, and this work is happening in different ways at different points of the, I mean, in different parts of the world. So for instance, you know, there's an increasingly large movement of indigenous data sovereignty, which is to think about indigenous communities and of governance which enables communities to decide how their data is being used and not used. Similarly, you know, mechanisms such as data cooperatives are coming up to similarly govern data collectively, realizing its collective value. Now, the other thing also which is interesting is that our ability to negotiate with technology platforms is diminished, whether it's people living in privileged communities of the West or people living in other parts of the world. We are all marginalized when it comes to our relationship with technology and platforms. So it is also increasingly becoming important to think about how to collectively bargain in our relationships with technology platform. And then again, thinking about data as a collective resource and a platform for collective bargaining is critical. Now, to your point about marginalized communities, I think that, like I said, with regard to data and technology, we're all marginalized in different ways of severity. I think our ability to safeguard and protect our rights is fairly limited. But I think that this obviously manifests itself most significantly in communities that are traditionally marginalized as well, because now they have this additional vulnerability when it comes to negotiating with platforms. So they become increasingly involved in extractive relationships, but whether it's with the government or whether it's with tech companies. And these relationships end up, you know, they don't necessarily think about how the data that is extracted from these communities can be used in their benefit, but indeed, like, just to think of them as a source of data and, almost like as a bank, but they don't necessarily have a say in how the data is being used, whether it's being used for their benefit, etc. So obviously that means that they become further marginalized in this conversation about technology and data rights. And without this community or communal view of data, if we keep thinking about data as merely an individual resource that needs to be protected and not necessarily about a resource that needs to be unlocked, that needs to be bargained upon, that needs to be challenged, and a broader sense of resistance around questions of data that can only happen through a collective mobilization, I think that these marginalized communities will be further made vulnerable.
Thank you very much. I will now move to my second questions. As some of you may know, you're currently exploring alternative models of data ownership that can lead to different development outcomes. What are you learning from those initiatives? What are the biggest stumbling blocks, in your opinion, that you've seen, and how can we overcome them?
No, thank you for that question. So one thing I wanted to clarify is that data ownership is quite ambiguous, and it's not a phrase that I feel comfortable using. I think that the way we think about broadly what we define as data stewardship is the ability to, like I said, unlock the value of data, because data has a lot of collective value and public value attached to it, and also do that while making sure that communities and individuals that generate this data are involved in that decision making. So I think it's a question of governance and not so much ownership, and the degree of participation and involvement that individuals and communities have in that in that process of governance. Now, data cooperatives are an interesting way of thinking about governance, which moves away from what I was saying, an individualized view of data, into a more collective one. And it also empowers the data subjects or data principals with decision making over how data is used. So there are very interesting examples that are coming up out of the health sector, where in, say, for instance, there's an example of Me Data, which I think is based in Switzerland, where people come together, share their health data for research as a cooperative, and then they decide who this data is going to be shared with, what research they're looking to do, and if there are any payouts, then those are also divided between the members of the community, and all decisions are made democratically. Another example is Driver's Seat, which is based out in San Francisco, which is a collection or a cooperative of drivers on platforms such as Uber, Lyft, Grab, where drivers sign on to this cooperative and are able to get insights into how their data is being collected and used. And Driver's Seat is also able to collectivize this data and share it with municipalities, which may need it for better planning in terms of cities and urban planning and traffic, etc. And they also give drivers insights into their own data, and then hope over time, I hope that these drivers will be able to use this to collectively bargain with platforms. And if cities and municipalities purchase this data, the drivers share the profit. So I think interesting models and interesting ways of organizing around data are definitely coming up. I guess the big question that remains is, data is such a complex and fluid resource that how do we think of building a community around that? So for instance, we're on this Zoom call, the data that is being generated potentially is being generated by all of us on the Zoom call. So how do we think about decision makings? When does that happen? How do we organize disparate groups? And then how do we start to agree on purposes, etc.? So I think that sense of what is a community when it comes to data, I think is one of the big questions. I think this movement of what you called alternative data governance needs to answer. I think that once we answer that question, we need to get into the next step, which is, why will people like you and I, who are as part of the Zoom call, want to be a part of a cooperative that decides how this data is being used? So the question of what's in it for me? What do I get out of this? So am I able to get a certain degree of is decision making sufficient? So I get to decide, how my data is being used. Or in the case of, say, Uber drivers on driver's seat, they get visibility into how their data is being collected by Uber. Or in the case of me data, the members in the group might be patients of a certain disease that they want research on, and therefore they contribute to the cooperative. So that question of what's in it for me is important. And this is, of course, linked to a more complex idea of trying to figure out how people view the value of their data, right? Like right now, and we all do this, is that we don't necessarily think of the value of our data, whether it's being generated through a air quality sensor in our houses, or whether it's being generated through our Amazon purchase history. We prefer a certain convenience over trying to actively be part of the decisions on how this data is being used and not used. So that question again is intrinsically linked to what's in it for me. So I think that communicating value of data, and that's been our experience as we've been trying to think about mobilizing a group of people. We've been trying to work with a fisheries cooperative in India, and trying to think about how these fishery farmers can come together and build a data cooperative, because their community, as part of an organization, they generate a lot of financial and professional data. They're also, they've got sensors in their ponds that they use for fisheries. So there's a lot of non-human data also being generated, and we're trying to understand how farmers can come together and control the decisions around this data. But it's a really complex sell to say, like, here's another set of decisions you need to make, here's why it's important, here's what you get out of it, because the value is not always tangible, or at least it's not immediately tangible. So I think that, and then I think beyond that, and this is linked to the first part of like who is a community, I think that any kind of cooperative building exercise, and a lot of people have done this in different parts of the world for different questions, is mobilizing people around a certain issue is always complex. And so we have to think about how we bring people together. So answer what a community is, figure out what the value of data is, and what brings people together, and then of course do the hard work of bringing people together. I think it's interesting that a lot of the data cooperative work is happening outside of in the labor sector, because there is a clear realization that data is use, or is a tool for exercising power over people by platforms. And there's an immediate sense of like, if I control my data, then I'll be able to negotiate better. But in other parts of the world or other sectors, it may not be entirely clear. So I think that community building is critical. And then I think like we have to get into more sort of functional questions about how do we use cooperatives to bargain, how do we resolve questions of quote unquote monetizing data, what are the business models, how do we make sure that they're accountable, what are the ways in which we make sure that the members of the cooperative remain actively involved in decision making. And I think that question of accountability becomes more and more important. So I think that those are some of the areas. And also, like, just to say that this is a very new field, and I think that while regulation keeps mentioning them in a few ways here and there, I think that there's a lot of work that's needed, both from civil society organizations, nonprofits, but also, the think tank and research world, to come together and actually test some of these ideas out. Because without that information of what these conceptual ideas mean offline and in the real world, I don't think we'll know very much about them. Because and I think that we also need to learn from other movements, like other cooperative movements, other movements of organizing people. I think that the commons approach to natural resources, which a lot of people are studying, and Elena Ostrom's work on governing the commons is served to be quite a lighthouse when it comes to thinking about some of this. But I think, like, again, we need to do more work on the ground, and need to work a variety of people, because we don't want ideas like data cooperatives to just be confined to people in the know. We want them to be far more spread out. And I think that that requires a lot of time and a lot of coming together of different stakeholders, whether it's technologists, whether it's activists, whether it's community mobilizers. So yeah.
So thanks again, and I would like to thank all of our panel speakers for sharing their insight today, both in terms of how physical, digital, and financial infrastructure perpetuate different inequalities and the impact this has on human well-being down to the biological level. Before we open the session for question and answers, let me maybe reflect on some and invite reflections maybe from the audience on maybe some key areas that I think have surfaced from the interaction with our four panelists. First, I think it's important to continue to reflect and take into consideration the socio-spatial networks that link people to their neighborhoods and address the vulnerabilities and risks that have long existed in the area before a specific crisis has taken place. I think all the speakers highlighted the importance of active engagement and dialogue between local communities and government to transform present structure that perpetuate inequalities, poverty, and marginalization. I think it's also clear that the critical need for data-driven approach so that we can better understand the connection between access to infrastructure, inequality, vulnerabilities, and we push for an inclusive recovery process. Finally, it will be interesting to continue the discussions as to how access to justice, security, and human welfare is constrained when digital technology is leveraged without considering issues of privacy, ethics, and equity. So thanks again. Those are some initial maybe points for further discussions, but really very much looking forward to our live discussions and our Q&A segment. Thank you very much again, and please stay tuned for the live Q&A sessions that will begin shortly.